So yesterday we started discussing about the mechanisms of homeostatic regulation, and we talked about the fact that the two most common types of feedback are negative feedback, or the two types, I should say, are negative feedback, which is the most common, and positive feedback, which is not as common, but just because it's not as common doesn't mean that it doesn't have a place within the humans. So let's start here with negative feedback. What exactly do we mean by negative feedback? Negative feedback is a way that we correct the disturbance in homeostasis by actually producing a response that opposes it. In other words, it does the opposite. So the way I try to think of this is the response actually negates the disturbance. Okay? And that's where they get this idea of negative feedback. The classic examples of negative feedback in terms of anatomy and physiology are body temperature, which we've already kind of discussed, and blood sugar levels. So let's go through first. We're actually going to go through both of these. Let's go first through the regulation of blood sugar. Okay, and that's why you have this diagram here showing the pancreas. All right, I just need to get my pen up here. Erase that, that's old. Okay, so blood sugar levels are actually controlled, like I said, by the pancreas. So in order for us to correct something, we first have to get the signal that something is different from homeostasis. In other words, something is kind of out of whack. So in this case, the pancreas is actually going to receive a message. It's going to monitor our blood, and it receives a message that our blood glucose level, that's what BGL stands for, is low. So that gets actually received in the pancreas. We have actually two different types of cells. The cell that detects that the blood glucose levels are low are called the alpha cells. And the alpha cells of the pancreas, when they detect that the blood glucose levels are low, they release a hormone that is going to kind of counteract that. They release a hormone called glucagon. And what that does is it makes the liver change our glycogen, which is our stored glucose, into glucose that can go into the blood. All right, so we get this stimulus that is detected in the body, and then we get a response that is negative feedback. Okay? Now, the pancreas also monitors the opposite effect. Okay, so let's say the alpha cells are releasing glucagon, okay, and so our blood, what's going to happen is our BGL levels will go up, okay. Now eventually that's going to cause the pancreas to realize that our blood glucose levels are now high. That actually stimulates a different type of cell in the pancreas, and these are called the beta cells, and they're going to release a different hormone, and this is the one you're probably more familiar with. This is insulin. And what this does is it makes the body cells absorb that available glucose. So it's actually going to pull that glucose out of the bloodstream. So as you release that insulin, then the blood glucose levels are going to go down. And again, it's going to feed back. And you can see we have this shifting, like we said, okay, this up and down shifting around our homeostasis level. Now you can see here where diabetes comes into play. Diabetes comes into play here, this disease, disturbance in homeostasis. If those beta cells are unable to produce insulin, or for whatever reason the body cells are not able to get the message. Let's say there's something wrong with the insulin that's released. They don't receive that message, so they can't absorb the blood glucose. So that blood glucose level, as you can see, is just going to stay very high. And that's one of the dangers of being diabetic, is that you can then have very high blood glucose levels, and that's one of the things that they actually have to test for. All right, so that's one of the classic examples. Let's look at the next one. And this one is body temperature, which is monitored by the brain. And we talked about body temperature before. So let's say that I'm at a point where my body temperature is high. Let's just start there. So that gets actually fed into the brain, into a section called the hypothalamus. So I'll write that there just in case you want to know. We will be talking about the hypothalamus during the nervous system. And what happens is the hypothalamus actually triggers responses in our body that are going to oppose this. In other words, try to push that body temperature down. So we do things like sweating and dilating our blood vessels at the skin. So some of us get that flushed look. Because we're trying to release that excess heat. Okay? So as we do this, we are going to decrease our temperature. Now again, as that continues, we can actually feed back again to the brain, and we can see that we could potentially take this so our body temperature is low. Or we could just have a low body temperature. Again, that's going to feed into the hypothalamus of the brain. And the hypothalamus, and this is an automatically generated response, it's going to decrease the amount that we sweat. It's going to decrease our blood flow to the skin. And we're going to try to actually generate heat to increase our temperature. And one of the ways we do that is through shivering. What we're trying to do basically is contract our skeletal muscles, because a byproduct of that is heat. And then that is going to cause an increase in temperature, which again could feed back, or if we take it to a normal level, it would actually cut off. So you can see here, this is actually how positive feedback works. We get a condition, a disruption in homeostasis, and the response that is produced tries to counteract that or oppose it. It tries to make it do the opposite of what it is doing. That's what negative feedback does. And those are two kind of, like I said, classic examples, very easy ones to understand because those are things you're familiar with. Sorry. Okay. So the other type is positive feedback. Now, positive feedback kind of works the opposite way. What it does is it corrects our disturbance by producing a response that actually is going to continually get bigger. So the response, what it's trying to do is correct the disturbance, but the response will actually get stronger and stronger and stronger until the disturbance stops. Two kind of classic examples, and really the two only examples that we will try to work with positive feedback, are blood clotting, and that's what I'm going to show you today, and labor and delivery, which obviously only would impact the females in the classroom. So this example I actually have animated here on the PowerPoint, and it's going to kind of go across my screen and then down. So just so you guys kind of know how things are laid out, you can lay it out in your notes however you wish. So with blood clotting, we start obviously with bleeding. When we have bleeding occurring, we get certain chemicals that are released into the bloodstream that actually get picked up that cause clotting to occur. As that clotting occurs, this is actually where the feedback happens. it feeds back, and as the bleeding continues, we get more chemicals released, which causes more clotting to happen. So you can see how we kind of get in the circular pattern here, and this will continue. We will get more clotting and more chemicals released, and more clotting is going to increase exponentially until the bleeding stops, and that will actually cut off the feedback mechanism and stop the response. Now, labor and delivery works very much the same way. We get the onset of labor, and as you know, labor contractions or uterine contractions at the start of labor are actually very mild, and at the end of labor, it's typically what we see on movies and television where the woman is like screaming and stuff. They get very, very intense, but they stop once the baby's been born. So the disturbance is that the baby is ready to be born, and so we get this increasing response until that disturbance is corrected. All right, so that kind of finishes up our homeostasis. Now, homeostasis is something, and these negative feedback mechanisms are something that you have to recognize. So I do have kind of like a multiple choice mini quiz. It's not going to be graded. All right, what I want you to do is kind of take a couple minutes to look things over here, and then you'll get that worksheet. I want you to complete that worksheet and turn it in, and then we will move on to cancer.